Welcome back to World History. Today, we're learning about Chapter 9. Let's get into it. All right, so in Chapter 9, we're learning about Greece and Persia. All right, so we're going to learn about, and I hope I'm pronouncing these names right, but I'm probably not, but we'll do the best we can. Here we go. We got Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. I'm pretty sure I got Xerxes right. I don't know about the other two. Anyhow, we're going to learn about the Persian Wars, and this will be when Persia is expanding out, and they're basically expanding out of Asia, and they're starting to go towards Europe, and Greece is going to be there, and Greece is going to resist that expansion, okay? And there's two big wars that are important, the Battle of Marathon, and then also the Battle of Thermopylae. We'll talk about some Greek thinkers, Socrates, Plato, Herodotus. All you need to know about him is he's one of the first historians. And we really need to focus on Sparta and Athens, both as a city-state and then showing you the dichotomy. One city-state is basically a war, I don't want to call it a war machine, but yeah, I mean, they produce soldiers, and the other one's more of an intellectual, more of a thinking machine. Okay, so we'll talk about that. Understand the Persian Wars, epic battles that changed history. What's the difference between Sparta and Athens? Okay, military and mind. And then how do Greek ideas impact our culture today? Democracy might be the biggest one. Okay, so the United States is a blend of Greece and Rome and Enlightenment thinking, basically. Okay. So Cyrus the Great, he starts the Persian Empire. He let the conquered people, the people that he conquered, he let them keep their religion. This is different than when we were learning about Judaism and the Maccabees, and they were fighting because they didn't want to give up their religion. He says, hey, you can keep your religion, just send me the taxes. That's all I care about, just send me your money, all right? Here's the Persian Empire, so you can see that it takes over, parts of Egypt, all of modern-day Turkey, into Iraq, Iran. Okay, it really starts in Iran, is where the Persian Empire starts with the Medes and expands out. Here's a little video.
A century ago, a conflict arose which would quickly become one of the most complex and controversial in the world. A conflict between two very different people for the same territory. To understand its origins, let's retrace the history of the Jewish people on a map. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be explained in a following video. The story begins in 750 BC when the Near East was divided into many small kingdoms and city-states. They were wedged between the Assyrian Empire to the north and Egypt in the south. Among them was the Kingdom of Israel, whose people worshipped several gods, including Yahweh. In 722 BC, the capital Samaria fell to the Assyrian Empire. Part of the population then fled to the Kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem, but they would be followed by the Assyrian army as they continue their expansion towards the south. The region then remains under their control for a century until the fall of Nineveh to the Babylonians. Egypt and Babylon would then compete for territories of the old empire, but the Babylonians quickly take over and project their power in the region. Jerusalem resists this new rule and rebels. The Babylonian army then returns to besiege and destroy the city. Much of the population is then moved to the capital. In 539 BC, the Achaemenid Persian Empire takes over Babylon. The new king authorizes a free passage for Judeans, prompting many to return to Jerusalem. They would then rebuild the city and organize the foundations of Jewish culture by building the Temple of Solomon and writing the Torah. In 334 BC, the ambitious young Macedonian king Alexander the Great set out with his army to conquer the known world.
And here's another video that just shows you on a map how it expands out. so throughout time you'd had wars, but Herodotus goes, we should write these down. And there, voila, now you've got history, okay? So the Persian Wars, understand that Persia is over there in Turkey and Iran, and it's expanding and it's bumping into Greece, okay? And it's starting to take up these little islands, and the Greeks are going to come and they're going to resist. And that's what these Persian Wars are. So here is a small video about the Battle of Marathon.
The Battle of Marathon was fought in the year 492 BC and was part of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian Empire was beginning to spread into Europe, and under the command of Datis and Artaphernes, the Persian army successfully invaded and conquered the Aegean Islands. One of the captured regions, Ionia, aided by the city-state of Athens, rebelled against Persian rule. Although the Persians put down the rebellion, they wanted revenge against the Athenians and invaded the Greek mainland, landing at Marathon. The Persian army was made up of about 16,000 soldiers and included archers, but the cavalry had been sent away. The best Persian soldiers were placed at the centre, and the weaker soldiers, who were usually supported by the cavalry, were placed on the flanks. The Athenian army, commanded by Miltiades, had around 11,000 soldiers, but with no archers or cavalry. The formation used on the day was a single line. It was the same length as the Persian line, but thinly manned in the centre. The Greek flanks were deeper and stronger. The battle started with the Athenians advancing. At first they moved slowly in formation towards their opponents, but hoping to repel them, the Persian archers began shooting arrows at the advancing forces. To avoid this, the Athenians started running straight towards the Persian front line. The speed of the Athenians meant they were a difficult target for the archers to aim at, and many of the arrows went over the Athenian line. The two forces now collided, and many of the Persians on the front line were killed with the impact of the Greek charge. Both Persian flanks were weak, and the Athenians, with a stronger formation and equipped with better armour and weapons, were able to inflict huge damage to the Persian forces. Seeing that they were losing, both Persian flanks began retreating towards their boats. In the centre, although initially the Persians were struggling, with their superior weight of numbers and better trained soldiers, they were beginning to slowly push back the thin Greek line. But, despite the immense pressure, the Athenian line did not break. With their opposition in retreat, the Athenians on the flanks now turned to assist the weak centre. The Persians had become enveloped and were attacked on all sides. When they realised the situation, many of them began to retreat. Most fled towards the waiting Persian ships, but some became trapped in the marsh close to the battlefield and were drowned. Datis formed a small rearguard action to protect his fleeing men as they attempted to escape in the boats, but the line was soon defeated, and the Athenians were able to capture 7 Persian ships. At the end of the battle, the Persians had lost over 6,000 men, but the Athenians only lost about 200. This was a victory for the Greeks. The Persians considered another attack at Athens, but when they arrived, they found that the Athenian army was already there to defend the city. Seeing this, the boats turned around and sailed back to Persia.
Okay, so after the Battle of Marathon, the Greek messenger runs back to Athens, and it's 25 miles away or something along those lines. And that's why we run a marathon, which is 26.2 miles. And that comes out of this, where the Greek messenger went from Marathon back to Athens, okay? So, later, Persian War II, okay? Xerxes doesn't want, he wants to make up for the loss at Marathon, and he's going to march an even bigger army into Greece. But here's the thing, they're going to have to go through these 2 canyons. It's sort of the fatal funnel concept, and they're going to have an army of Greeks supported by 300 Spartans, and they will last for days against this battle, all right, against these Persian troops. So this video is kind of long, but it's really informative. Please enjoy the Battle of Thermopylae.
This is Thermopylae, on the coast of mainland Greece. I'm Matthew Settle. In August 480 BC, a Greek army of only 7,000 men led by King Leonidas and 300 Spartans, fought here against a 250,000-strong invasion force, led by Xerxes, the king of Persia. At stake, the future of Greek civilization.
Now, with new video game technology, you are about to see this great battle as never before.
The vast numbers of soldiers, the troop formations, how they fought, and how the battle was won. Get the view the generals wished they had. Now, on decisive battles.
Two and a half thousand years ago, Greece was not a unified nation. It was a collection of independent city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, each with their own laws and systems of government. The Greeks lived under the shadow of the mighty Persian Empire, which stretched from present-day countries like Turkey, through northern Egypt, Israel, Iran and Iraq, to Afghanistan and northern India. 2/3 of the known world. But even this was not enough for the Persian king Xerxes. He wanted to expand into Europe. Greece was the gateway. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had been defeated by the Greeks at Marathon. Xerxes was determined not to suffer the same fate. He gathered a huge army from all corners of his empire. 250,000 men set out for Greece.
Xerxes' expeditionary force to try to conquer mainland Greece was the mother of all expeditionary forces. Nothing like this had really been attempted before in the history of ancient warfare.
In 480 BC, Xerxes crossed the Hellespont and moved his army down through northern Greece, while the Persian fleet sailed along the coast. City after city fell.
Xerxes was a pretty fierce sort of guy. He wouldn't stop at anything to achieve his aims.
But Xerxes' goal was Athens. The Greeks had to stop him at all costs, and they had to do it here at Thermopylae. Otherwise, he would have a clear run to Athens.
Given the configuration of the Greek peninsula, that is where an army of any size has to come down. Thermopylae was the obvious place.
The Greek name Thermopylae means hot gates. The place was famous for its hot springs.
With high rugged mountains on both sides, the narrow pass was easily defensible. But it was also the gateway to Greece. But 2,000 years of sea and wind have eroded the battle site away. This is what it looked like in 480 BC. The Greeks sent an army of 7,000 men to hold the pass. They were joined by 300 soldiers from the city of Sparta. It is impossible to imagine a city more unlike Athens than Sparta.
For Spartan society was at the opposite pole from Athenian society. Athenians were very open. The society was wide open to anyone who wanted to come there, and they would share everything with us, whereas the Spartans was a very closed society.
Spartans were educated to be soldiers, nothing else. From the age of 7, all Spartan boys trained for war. The army was their life. Even when married, the Spartan men had to live in barracks.
They couldn't take up any other trade. They couldn't deal in business or commerce. All ordinary work was done by slaves.
Sparta was a small town. It had no more than 9,000 peers, full Spartan citizens at any one time. So this army, everybody knew everybody else. If you were standing in formation, your brother might be over there, a couple of ranks behind. Your father might be over here. Your cousins would be over there.
They provided the leadership, they provided the spearhead, they provided the backbone. In every respect, their presence was what made Thermopylae what it was.
The 300 Spartans that marched to Thermopylae were led by Leonidas, the king of Sparta. He wasn't optimistic about his chances against Xerxes. For one thing, he had set out during a Spartan religious festival. This was thought to bring bad luck.
Also, the Greeks had received bad news from the oracle here at Delphi. The priestess predicted that a Spartan king would have to die before victory was won.
Leonidas' wife, Gorgo, asked him what she should do if he didn't return from battle. To which he replied, "Marry a good man, have children."
He was apparently of absolute determined resolution and personally brave. He would have been in his 50s, not a young man, coming up towards retiring age, even in ancient Greek terms.
The Spartans wore a sculpted bronze breastplate and a helmet designed to terrify the enemy. Each man carried a shield shaped like a shallow wooden bowl. Painted on the face of the shield was the Greek letter lambda, for lack of diamond, the Spartan homeland. The main weapon was a thrusting spear, wielded overarm. 8 foot long with an ash shaft, a leaf-shaped iron head, and a bronze butt spike. In close combat, they drew the short sword, the xiphos. By contrast, King Xerxes' Persian army was lightly armed. These men were trained for fast-moving warfare on open plain. Xerxes relied heavily on the Medes, who were deadly archers. The pride of place went to his elite band of 10,000 immortals.
The immortals were the cream of the Persian army. They were recruited as an elite. The term immortal was the Greek one, which they used because they believed that every time one of the 10,000 was killed, instantly in reserve there was another guy waiting just to step into his place.
Leonidas stood with his Spartans at the narrowest point in the pass. 7,000 Greek troops deployed behind them. They defended a low wall. Xerxes drew up his army on the flat floor of the entrance to the pass.
Xerxes waited 4 days once they got into position there because he couldn't believe that these Greeks were going to actually stand and fight. He thought it was a joke.
On the 5th day, his patience ran out. He demanded, "Surrender your weapons." Leonidas shouted back, "Come and get them."
A lone scout rider got sent by the Persians up to where the Spartans were waiting before the battle. And some of the Spartans were out there doing their gymnastics. They were oiled up and they were combing their hair. And the rider it just blew his mind. What were these guys doing? How could they be so blasé? And of course, what they really were doing was psyching themselves up to fight to the death.
Xerxes had a throne set up on a nearby hill. From several hundred feet above, he ordered his Medes into action. From their vantage point, the Greeks could only see a few thousand. This was merely the advance party for a force of 10,000 Medes, which wound round behind the mountain. Leonidas held back his Spartans and ordered the Greek troops forward. The Battle of Thermopylae had begun. It would not be the walkover that Xerxes imagined. August 480 BC, the Greek army led by King Leonidas and 300 Spartans is facing a Persian army of 250,000 men.
The Persian king Xerxes watched in disbelief as 700 Greek troops formed up at the valley entrance. They lined up in a phalanx formation. phalanx was a forest of spears.
The commander would signal for the push, the rear ranks pushing forward and pressing their shields against the backs of the men in front, and you pushed against the forces opposing you and literally tried to shove them backwards and drive them off the field. They trained their whole lives for this moment.
This phalanx was 18 men deep and 64 across. Their shields overlapped like the scales of a serpent's back, virtually impenetrable.
The first three ranks lowered their spears and rolled forward towards the Medes. In contrast to the Greeks, the Medes were lightly armed. They carried light wickerwork shields and spears. Before they advanced, the Mede archers fired a volley into the phalanx. Leonidas sent in more Greeks to reinforce the phalanx, pressing their weight into the backs of their fellow troops. Volley after volley of arrows filled the sky.
The Greek infantry had a 3-foot shield. The shields were bronze-faced with maybe 2 inches of oak underneath that. So if you want to think of that as a kitchen cutting board. And how hard you can whack a cutting board with a battle axe and you can't break it.
As the Greeks began to tire, Leonidas sent in his Spartan warriors. They advanced in a phalanx formation as the exhausted Greeks ran back.
As they would advance, they would be talking to each other and inspiring each other, encouraging each other to advance while these other people are advancing towards you. I mean, as each step got closer and closer, the terror must have been unbelievable.
The highly trained Spartans slaughtered all in front of them. The Medes saw that their own weapons were useless, and in desperation began grabbing at the Spartan spears. But now the Spartans drew the Xiphos, and the real butchery began.
Are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you thirsty? Are you wounded? It doesn't matter. You're a warrior and you fight.
The confined space made it impossible for the Persians to take advantage of their superior numbers. They could not pack enough men into battle against this unrelenting killing machine.
Combat in those days was all hand-to-hand. Nobody shot anybody. No smart bombs came in. If you were going to kill the enemy, he was going to be right in your face and trying to kill you.
Wave after wave of Xerxes' warriors perished as they tried to penetrate the Spartan shield wall.
Leonidas joked. Xerxes has plenty of men, but no soldiers. But the Spartans took casualties as well.
The Spartans had a method for identifying their dead, many of whom were battered beyond recognition. They would take a twig and put their mark at either end. And they'd break it in half. Half was kept in a bulb behind the lines, and the other was worn around the wrist. So there you have the ancient equivalent of a dog tag.
If the soldier survived, he could reclaim his twig after the battle. If not, the dead and lost could be easily counted. As the battle moved into the second day, the Persians could make no headway. They were simply not prepared for this kind of fighting. Far removed from the wide-open plains of the east where cavalry, chariots, and light infantry could decide the outcome.
Sitting on his hillside throne, Xerxes became more and more agitated, jumping to his feet every so often like a spectator at a football game.
Xerxes just said, hey, you guys go out there and take that pass, kick these guys out of the way. And these lightly armed Medes went up against the heavily armed Greeks, and the heavily armed Greeks kicked their butt.
Xerxes decided to play his trump card and send in the immortals. There might have been hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the battlefield, but now the combat was between two fighting elites. 10,000 Persian immortals against what remained of 300 Spartans.
August 480 BC. The Spartans had held the pass at Thermopylae for nearly a day and a half. Xerxes had failed to crack their defense. Now he gambled everything by sending in his own personal guard, the Immortals.
They were a magnificent sight. They carried bows, spears, and short daggers. But rank after rank of the elite shock troops fell in the dust.
The light-armed Persians couldn't penetrate the Greek armor, but the Greeks could penetrate them at will. And also the Greeks were trained to fight at close quarters and to come to grips at close quarters.
Nothing could shake the Spartans. Xerxes needed a miracle, and it came from an unexpected source.
A Greek trader, Ephialtes, seeing a chance to get rich quick, crossed over to the Persian camp. He told Xerxes about a pathway that wound around the mountainside and came out behind the Spartans.
The name Ephialtes has entered the modern Greek language. It means nightmare in modern Greek. Ephialtes is today a nightmare.
Under cover of darkness, the Persians filed up the track, and on the morning of day 3, emerged behind the Spartans. Leonidas had been outflanked.
He knew this would be his last battle. To avoid unnecessary casualties, he sent the rest of the Greek army home.
The Spartans would stand alone.
It must have been an amazingly emotional moment as men were walking out, brave men, knowing they were going to live, while others were walking up to the front line knowing that they were going to die.
One of the Greeks had warned, the Persians have so many archers that their arrows will blot out the sun. Well said the Spartan Dionysus, we will fight in the shade.
This was Spartan wit. And when somebody says something like that, you laugh and fear goes away.
Leonidas was more somber. He ordered his men to breakfast, saying, "Tonight, we shall dine in Hades."
As the battle recommenced, the Persians closed in from both sides on the tiny band of Spartan survivors. But the Spartans, with nothing to lose, fought like demons. The Persians suffered heavy losses.
Then Leonidas fell. His Spartan soldiers rushed forward to save his body from capture and mutilation.
The fact that the Greeks fought in the way they did to preserve his body from the Persians at the moment of final defeat again symbolizes how important the position, the status, the role of the king, the leader, actually was.
Xerxes now decided to bring this battle to a quick end.
He had tried to fight soldier to soldier in the honorable tradition of his Persian ancestors, but he could not break the Spartans. He had lost nearly 10,000 men, including 2 of his own brothers. He decided to withdraw his troops. He would finish the Spartans off at a safe distance with arrows. The Spartans regarded the bow as a weapon for cowards because it killed from a distance. Thousands of arrows rained down on the broken Spartans until not one was left standing. They were finished off by the weapons they despised most.
All right, welcome back. So the Battle of Salamis, that's a naval battle, but it employs the same principles where you can't get all the boats in because they're sitting in a narrow way, sitting in there, kind of creating that fatal funnel. So in Sparta, this slide just shows you your age. If you're 7 to 12, you just leave home for basic education. 12 to 18, physical training. 18 to 20, military training. And 20 to 30, military service. Now this is pretty interesting. Look at this. If you're a woman in Sparta, you get to own land, you run the household, versus in Athens, women can't own property and they can't vote, they don't serve in the government. So in a lot of ways, if you're a woman, you're freer in Sparta. Why do you think that is? Yeah, because the men probably are going to get killed more often in battle, something like that. And so that's just kind of interesting. Okay, going to Athens now. We got two things to talk about. We got Socrates, we got Plato, we got Archimedes. Maybe there's three things in there we need to talk about. Ship of state analogy. This is the ship of state. Plato said basically that democracy is anarchy, and that we're all on this ship of state. We're all on this boat. I like to think of it as an airplane. I like to modernize it. We're on the airplane of state analogy. We're all on this airplane together, and it's starting to crash. Well, we all vote what we should do, but we don't know how to fly the plane. The pilot should fly the plane. That's what Plato would say. Plato would say the captain of the ship should be in charge, not the people on the ship per se. Okay? Now, whether you agree with that or not, I'm not telling you that. I'm just telling you that's the analogy, okay? Ship of state analogy. The allegory of the cave, which will be attached. Please read it and do your best. It's very hard, very difficult reading, and there'll be a little cartoon here to help you explain it. But the allegory of the cave, Plato says we're just staring at shadows. We don't see the actual essence. And if you get out of the cave and you learn the truth and you come back and you preach the truth to the people in the cave, they don't want to hear it. Okay, so he's just expressing his resentment as a philosopher. Okay, he would say the philosopher king should be in charge. All right, and that's going a little bit back to the ship of state analogy. So enjoy both the allegory of the cave reading and allegory of the cave cartoon.
What is reality? Knowledge, the meaning of life. Big topics you might tackle figuratively, explaining existence as a journey down a road or across an ocean, a climb, a war, a book, a thread, a game, a window of opportunity, or an all too short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind, and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out. In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order, and his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher kings.
Okay, so later, Athens will fight Sparta in something called the Peloponnesian Wars, okay? And that's pretty interesting. And then let's talk about Archimedes. Archimedes was given a task. He's given this crown. He needs to find out if the crown is real gold or fake gold, but he can't cut the crown open. And so he thinks and he thinks and he can't figure it out. And as the story goes, he's sitting in the bath and he goes, Eureka, we got to dip the crown into water and see how much water it displaces, and that's how we'll know the density of the crown. Okay, so now we're on to some more Greece. It's Greece part 2. Now it's Alexander the Great. Okay, we're going to learn about him. Once his kingdom falls apart, they're called the Hellenistic kingdoms. But why? Why does his kingdom fall apart so quickly? Let's talk about it. And then we'll get into some of the Greek achievements with art and science and things like that. You can see that Macedonia is just a touch above Greece right there. And there's his empire on the map. And it's basically the Persian Empire, okay? Persia expands out, Greece kind of stops him, the rise of Alexander the Great, and then he expands out and conquers everything and could have pretty much kept going. His army just gets tired of conquering. They want to go home. Here's another map. It shows the direction he goes. He goes down into Egypt and then back over into what would be modern-day Iraq and Iran, and all the way basically to Afghanistan and India. When he's 18, he starts commanding troops. When he's 20, he becomes the ruler, but by 33, he's dead. So pretty short and impactful life. Their military uses what's called a phalanx formation, and that's just this cube of soldiers, and it's strong because if you push them back, they can kind of add weight, and they have a long spear called a sarissa. Again, hope I pronounced that right. So when he dies, his kingdom falls into these 4 other kingdoms. All you need to know is what comes after Alexander the Great. 1, 2, 3, Hellenistic kingdoms. You don't need to know which ones they are or what they're called or any of that, but you can see them here on the map. So why is he called Alexander the Great? Because he conquers a large amount of land, okay? And then he helps unify the known world with language and things like that, okay? But why does his kingdom break up so quickly? He's good at conquering. He's not necessarily good at administering, okay? He doesn't create some awesome government. He just has an awesome war machine that expands very quickly. But to have a lasting kingdom, that's going to be based on other principles, usually creating an infrastructure, an administration, a government, things like that, which was not his cup of tea. So once he's gone, poof, it breaks down into 4 other kingdoms. So here we're going to talk about Aristotle. He says there's 11 virtues, and you need to find the balance. So let's take humor, for example. If you have no sense of humor, you're a bore. But if you have too much humor, you're a buffoon. You want to be right in that sweet spot. You want to be witty, okay? That's what he would say about your virtues. Don't be too extreme to either side. Be right there. Find the balance between these virtues, okay? So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Make sure you guys take the quiz on Wednesday, and have a great day.